Today, I will introduce the book My Promised Land, subtitled The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. The author, Ari Shavit, a well-known Israeli columnist and Middle East expert. This book is New York Times Bestseller, named one of the best books of 2013 by the New York Times Book Review and The Economist. The book explores Israel's extensive history through personal experiences, in-depth interviews, historical documents, private diaries, and letters. By presenting a series of compelling individual stories, the author attempts to paint a comprehensive picture of Israel, prompting deeper reflections on the state of the nation and historically examining the roots of conflicts in the Middle East. Israel has recently become a hot topic in Middle Eastern history. Among all Middle Eastern countries, the story of Israel is particularly compelling. Before the establishment of Israel, Jews suffered through centuries of extensive diaspora, enduring great hardships. After its establishment, Israel faced 5 Middle Eastern wars, marked by relentless warfare. Despite these adverse geopolitical circumstances, Israel has managed to create miracles. Its Iron Dome defense system, the Mossad intelligence agency, and the innovative city of Tel Aviv are among the world's top achievements. Many countries have benefited from Israeli innovations. All these achievements seem to point to one fact: Israel is very powerful. However, this book is quite special. It raises some reflective questions. If Israel's success is built on the oppression of another nation, does its success have legitimacy? Additionally, Israel managed to defeat a coalition of 7 Arab nations at its founding, when it was extremely impoverished, but by 2006, despite being the dominant power in the Middle East, it struggled to defeat 8,000 Hezbollah militants. Has Israel become stronger, or has it become more vulnerable? Some describe this book as a comprehensive history of Israel, but a closer look reveals it as a colonial history of the Zionist movement. The so-called Zionist movement refers to the efforts of Jews scattered around the world to return to their historical homeland in Palestine and re-establish a Jewish state. In essence, the Zionist movement succeeded through colonization. Israel was founded on colonization, but today's Israel is deeply questioned because it continues this colonization. Many Israeli scholars avoid discussing the colonial nature of the Zionist movement, which makes this book even more valuable. Ari Shavit, the author, is a representative of the New Historians in Israel, a group that dares to challenge Israel's mainstream ideology and reflects on the colonial nature of the Zionist movement. This book is a representative work of that school. This book was first published in 2013, the 65th anniversary of the founding of Israel, a time of widespread celebration in the country. Reading this book feels like listening to an old man who, amid the celebrations, is using a knife to pick out a 65-year-old thorn embedded in his body. When you ask if it hurts, the answer is a heart-wrenching pain. Let's stop here for the introduction. Next, I will focus on colonialism and divide it into 3 parts to explain the triumph and tragedy of Israel. Let's start with the first part. How did the Zionist movement embark on a colonial path? You might find the term Zionist movement a bit obscure, so I'll put it another way. If you consider the Jewish return to Palestine a large-scale investment project, then this project can be divided into 3 phases. First, drafting a feasible project proposal. Second, finding suitable investors. And finally, implementing the task. The first to draft this project proposal was a Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl, who later became known as the father of Zionism. In the latter half of the 19th century, especially in countries like France, Germany, and Russia, a wave of anti-Semitism emerged, driving thousands of Jews away like rats crossing the street. For context, in 1896, Theodor Herzl wrote a pamphlet titled Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, which was described as a bolt from the blue, offering a vision of a homeland for the wandering Jews. However, Herzl's project proposal outlined only the goals and framework, lacking in details. In August 1897, he organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, where the proposal was refined. This Congress, even without a homeland, chose a national anthem for the prospective Jewish state, established the Jewish National Fund, and set up various committees and agencies to oversee the implementation of these plans. By then, the project proposal was essentially complete. A prominent Jewish family in Britain, the Rothschild family, acted as the angel investors for the Zionist movement. Baron Edmund de Rothschild contributed significantly to the Jewish National Fund, aiding early Jewish settlers in Palestine to purchase necessities, homes, equipment, and livestock. It is estimated that the amount he donated would be equivalent to $150 million today. Thus, with a project proposal and angel investors in place, the success of the Zionist movement depended on whether the Jewish settlers could establish a foothold in Palestine. However, the colonial nature of the Zionist movement became increasingly evident during this process. What exactly happened? This leads us to the moral dilemma encountered by the early Jewish settlers in Palestine. What was the moral dilemma? Simply put, Jews were expelled from Europe, and they detested those who expelled them. But upon arriving in Palestine, they realized it was not unoccupied land. Arabs were already there. What to do? If the Jews did not drive the Arabs out, their dream of statehood would be indefinitely postponed. But if they chose to expel the Arabs, wouldn't the Jews become the new colonizers? How to break through this bottleneck? Early Jewish settlers tried 3 approaches. The first 2 attempts failed. The first attempt could be called utopian. Some Jewish settlers established small communes in Palestine, forming tight-knit communities that were harmonious, free, and equal. However, many could not endure the harsh living conditions, loneliness, despair, and depression, and some even committed suicide. Most did not survive this ordeal and eventually moved to the United States. The second attempt was a bourgeois elite model. Simply put, it involved buying land and establishing colonies. Some wealthy Jews in Europe, including the aforementioned Baron Rothschild, made such investments. The author's great-grandfather conducted research in Palestine before preparing materials for the Zionist Congress and visited these colonies. They were described as brimming with middle-class lifestyles and liberal values. However, this approach was quickly blocked when the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine at the time, noticed the Jews' ulterior motives. The Ottomans adjusted their land transaction policies, stipulating that land could be bought and sold, but not to Jews. Thus, the Jews' plan to buy land failed. The Jewish settlers ultimately succeeded in establishing a foothold in Palestine through a third method, which was essentially a semi-military, semi-agricultural colonization system. A group of young Jewish volunteers played a major role in this process. In the summer of 1920, a group of fewer than 100 young Jewish laborers formed. A year later, they moved into a valley in Palestine called Harod Valley. After the utopian and land-for-money models failed, these young people saw themselves as the only hope for the survival of the Jewish people and the vanguard of the Jewish return to Palestine. They settled near the springs in the valley, lit torches, and dug trenches, organizing themselves like an army with camps and field kitchens. They worked during the day and returned to the camp for dinner in the evening, where they prayed and danced together. The author notes that in Palestine at the time, everything was free, and nothing could stop these ambitious and fearless young people. However, the colonial nature of the Zionist movement was gradually revealed through these young Jewish soldiers' struggles against nature and their conflicts with the surrounding Arabs. The early Zionist movement did not initially accept violent expulsion. For example, the aforementioned father of Zionism, Herzl, when deciding to purchase land in Palestine to settle Jewish refugees, consulted an investment advisor who reviewed his proposal. The advisor found the Harod Valley in Palestine to be wonderfully beautiful, but noted that dispersing the Arabs from the land would require violence. Herzl did not accept this approach. But by 1920, just after World War I had ended and the first global national liberation movement was underway, Zionist leaders hardened their hearts. They explicitly stated that when expelling Arabs, action must be decisive and swift. Conflicts between Jews and Arabs began to erupt frequently. The book states that the Jewish community was initially attacked by Arabs. But ultimately, who struck first is not important. What matters is that in the following years, the young Jewish army steadily encroached on Arab living spaces through a combination of occupation and expulsion. Arab villages began to be replaced by Jewish settlements. Then, Arabs suddenly realized that most of their territory had been taken over by Jews. In response, the Arabs set fire to Jewish farmlands. Subsequently, the first elite Jewish commando unit was formed, which conducted night raids on Arab villages, killing Arab civilians. Later, the Jews formed a real army, which expelled even more Arabs. By this point, we can actually answer the question posed at the beginning of this issue. How did Israel emerge from nothing and establish a nation, and how did the Jews drive a wedge into the heart of Middle Eastern geopolitics? Simply put, it was through a combination of occupation and expulsion. So, how should we view the Zionist movement today? The author of this book says that the Zionist movement is ultimately a desperate crusade, initiated by Jewish orphans abandoned by Europe. Europe is the surrogate mother of the Zionist movement. After these Jewish children were abandoned by their European mother, they found themselves alone in the world, godless, parentless, and homeless. They abandoned one civilization and had to establish a new one. They were forsaken by their old homeland and had to create a new homeland. This is why the Jews came to Palestine, desperately and firmly clinging to this land. Alright, this concludes the first part of our discussion on how the Zionist movement embarked on a colonial path. The second part. However, you might think that the Jews, in their quest to establish their own nation, were forced to resort to military measures, which might seem understandable. Once their goal was achieved, the situation should have improved. But is that really the case? On the contrary, after the establishment of Israel in 1948, colonial actions not only did not cease but intensified. This brings us to the second part of this audio issue. Why couldn't Israel shed its colonial nature after its establishment? What consequences has this colonial nature brought to modern Israel and today's Middle Eastern geopolitics? To understand these issues, we need to revisit two specific scenarios, one involving the Lydda massacre and the other involving Jewish settlements. Let's start with the Lydda massacre, which occurred just over a month after the establishment of Israel. One could say that Israel was founded and immediately went to war. On May 14, 1948, Israel officially declared its independence. But the day Israel was founded also marked the beginning of turmoil in the Middle East, as the old adversaries, the Arabs, did not accept it. A coalition of Arab nations attacked from the north and south, putting the nascent state of Israel in jeopardy. At the time, it was said that the inauguration ceremony for the founding of Israel lasted only half an hour. Some even suggested storing the original copy of Israel's Declaration of Independence, signed by everyone, in the Palestine Bank in England, in case the new nation perished in its infancy, leaving no historical documents for future generations. The subsequent war waged by the Arab coalition against Israel is known as the First Arab-Israeli War. But that's not the main focus of today's discussion. The focus is on a massacre that occurred during the war. This massacre took place in Lydda, a central Palestinian railway hub city, which was still under Arab control at the beginning of Israel's establishment. In May 1948, the First Arab-Israeli War broke out. According to a ceasefire agreement brokered by the United Nations, both sides agreed to a 28-day ceasefire starting on June 11th. During this ceasefire, the newly established state of Israel launched an operation to conquer Lydda under the guise of national defense. The book states that it was David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, who proposed the conquest plan. On July 11th, Israeli forces stormed into the center of Lydda in a blitzkrieg, subsequently shooting over 100 Arab civilians, including women, elderly people, and children. The next day at noon, Israeli soldiers in the area around a small mosque in Lydda shot and killed over 200 civilians, with the massacre lasting 30 minutes. This was the Lydda massacre. After the massacre, the frontline commander asked Ben-Gurion how to deal with the remaining Arabs in the city. Ben-Gurion casually waved his hand and issued a forward order: expel them. Thus, the Arabs in Lydda began to flee their homes, dragging children and carrying belongings. The commander in charge of the expulsion was Yitzhak Rabin. He later became Prime Minister of Israel and was a key figure in the Middle East peace process before being assassinated in 1995. Thus, the Jews, who had just escaped the Nazi Holocaust, committed a massacre against the Arabs in Lydda, turning victims into perpetrators. Before the establishment of Israel, Jews in Palestine had engaged in actions combining occupation and expulsion, but after the establishment of the state, the newly formed Israel added the killing of civilians to these actions. In the expulsion operation following the massacre, thousands of Arabs formed long lines and were driven out of their homes. The book describes how, at checkpoints on the outskirts of Lydda, Israeli soldiers, under the guise of security checks, forced Arabs to hand over cash, watches, and jewelry. They also molested Arab women during the exodus. Amid the chaotic crowd, children cried, women screamed, and men wept. Some women who were due to give birth were also forced to leave. Some gave birth on their knees during their flight. Israeli scholars later had severe disagreements about this chapter of history, with some defending the government, arguing that such situations are inevitable during war. However, others were incessantly critical. The author of this book takes a very firm stance, stating, "The truth is that Zionism could not tolerate Lydda." He even said that the actions in Lydda turned the Zionist movement into a modern-day dragon. How has this modern dragon changed today's Israel and the current situation in the Middle East? This brings us to the second topic I want to discuss with you, which has been a topic of ongoing debate up to today: the settlements. What are settlements? The settlements we're talking about here are the illegal Jewish settlements established by Israelis on occupied Palestinian territory. These settlements often experience explosions and attacks. But have you ever wondered why Israelis would want to occupy such unsafe places? Almost all member states of the United Nations condemn this occupation of another country's territory. But why can't Israel stop? To understand this issue, we need to first look at how the settlement movement came about. The emergence of Israel's settlement movement is related to two Middle Eastern wars. One is the Six-Day War in 1967, also known as the Third Arab-Israeli War. This war lasted 6 days, with Israel achieving a resounding victory and occupying a significant amount of Arab territory. At that time, Israel had been founded for less than 20 years, and the war tested the new nation's overall strength. The victory exhilarated the entire country, and the Jews felt proud. However, just 6 years later, in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, also known as the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, Israel was caught off guard by an Arab coalition and nearly faced annihilation. Although the Israeli military eventually turned the tide, the nation nearly suffered a catastrophic defeat. This profound sense of defeat sparked strong dissatisfaction among Israelis with their government, which was then led by the Labour Party. Some radical organizations seized the opportunity to pressure the government to build Jewish settlements in the occupied territories. It might be hard for us to understand today why, after achieving the dream of statehood, Jews would still want to occupy other people's land. Moreover, in the 1960s and 70s, colonialism had already been relegated to the dustbin of history. How could such a historically regressive act still occur in the world? But at the time in Israel, not only was this proposition openly made, but this historically regressive act also received strong public support. This necessitates a discussion of the set of modern Zionist undercurrents hidden behind the settlements. When early Zionist pioneers came to Palestine, they endured tremendous hardships and established one settlement after another in valleys and wildernesses, believing that a spark could start a prairie fire. Ultimately, they succeeded. Then, after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Israeli Jews experienced a profound sense of defeat, the young generation of Jews decided to revive the spirit of the early Zionist pioneers and take active measures during the national crisis. In their view, this was a reasonable decision. However, looking at it from another angle, this decision actually made a serious mistake. Simply put, it exposed two secret calculations of early Zionist pioneers. First, the early Zionists wanted to establish a state with a Jewish majority. Second, they cautiously distanced themselves from colonialism. For this, they disguised their actions of occupation and expulsion as a Jewish national liberation movement, very carefully restraining their behavior. Although they created the disaster in Lydda, they tried their best to hide this part of history. They worked diligently to build a strong Jewish state, hoping to use their outstanding governance achievements to cover up the early colonial nature and prove to the world, look, we Jews manage this place better than you Arabs, right? But the settlement movement that began in the 1960s and 70s overturned all this and brought new adverse consequences. First, the settlements are a form of occupation. While ostensibly following in the footsteps of their forebears, not only do they fail to help resolve the contradictions between Israel and the surrounding Arab nations, but they also alert the world to revisit the old accounts of Jewish colonialism, rendering Israel's efforts at decolonization futile. Second, the early Zionist pioneers achieved a state with a Jewish majority through occupation and expulsion. But can Jews still expel Arabs around the settlements today? If they cannot expel them, are the Jews who have moved deep into the settlements more secure or more endangered? The early Zionist pioneers paid a heavy moral cost and the price of war to expel the Arabs. Can today's young generation of Israelis bear this consequence? No one is confident. Third, the early Zionist pioneers defined the boundaries of the State of Israel, but the settlement movement has broken these established boundaries. How far do the Jews want to expand? The surrounding Arab nations are uncertain about this question. This great uncertainty about the future blurs the boundaries of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Faced with an uncertain future, everyone must always be on guard and always be prepared to fight. However, it must be said that there are insightful politicians in Israel. The book states that when radical young people launched a new occupation movement, the then Prime Minister of Israel, the famous Golda Meir, initially firmly rejected this request. But Meir could not withstand the dissatisfaction with the government in Israel after the Yom Kippur War, and she eventually compromised. There was a dramatic detail at the time. Radical organizations wanted to build new settlements in the occupied areas, and the news was reported to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. The Minister of Defense, Shimon Peres, reluctantly instructed the military not to actively assist the settlers, but also not to expel them. This was essentially the Israeli government turning a blind eye to the settlement movement. Thus, like an unstoppable chariot, the settlement movement, fueled by massive public support, dragged Middle Eastern geopolitics into an uncertain abyss. This is why the author Shavit says that the settlements are a noose around Israel's neck, with their illegality spreading like cancer from one organ to another, threatening the entire body. The third part. At this point, you have basically understood the Zionist movement. I'm sure you've noticed that the story of Jews returning to Palestine has a powerful backdrop. The ancestors of the Jews once established a nation in Jerusalem. The Jews ended their great diaspora and, guided by God, returned to their promised land. It can be said that the reason Jews want to return to Palestine is because of this backdrop. But what if I remove this backdrop? What do you think will happen? What do I mean? To put it more clearly, what if the entire story from beginning to end is fictional? Or what if God actually does not want the Jews to actively return to Palestine? Wouldn't the Zionist movement then become a tree without roots? A stream without a source, unable to withstand scrutiny? Although this may sound like a major twist, it is not just me speaking off the cuff. Because Zionism has never been able to fully escape these two doubts. Let's discuss the first doubt. Does the Zionist movement have historical basis? The stories of the Jews' ancestors mainly come from the Hebrew Bible. But a practical issue is that the Hebrew Bible recorded that the ancestors of the Jews left Palestine and went to ancient Egypt, where their descendants were oppressed, and the leader Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. This is the famous Exodus. However, modern archaeology has largely debunked the historical authenticity of the Exodus, considering it a myth reconstructed by the Israeli nation. I cannot verify archaeological findings, But the existence of these doubts, once supported by another force, makes the Jewish return story even more dubious. What is this other force? Comes from reality. That is, before the Zionist movement, Arabs had been living in Palestine for thousands of years. In the eyes of the Arabs, the Jews fabricated a Jewish national legend, and based on this fabricated story, they turned the tables and tried to drive the current Arabs out of their homes. This is also why the Arabs refused to implement the 1947 United Nations partition plan for Palestine. The second doubt about Zionism comes from a very important Jewish classic, the Babylonian Talmud. This is the most important Jewish religious work after the Bible and is still studied by traditional Jews around the world. This classic mentions 3 oaths made between Israel and the other nations of the world. 1. The other nations of the world swear not to oppress the Jewish people excessively. 2. The Jewish people swear not to use force to enter the land of Israel, which is now Palestine. 3. The Jewish people also do not resist the other nations of the world. For centuries, devout Jewish believers have thought that unless guided by God, they cannot actively return to their ancestral land, based on this scripture. Most understand that returning to that land would inevitably involve the use of force, which would violate their oaths. But actually, this is not the key issue. Religious Jews oppose the Zionist movement for deeper reasons. After centuries of diaspora, Jews believe that there are only 2 states in the world: diaspora and redemption. Under this concept, many Jews think that continuing the diaspora until God's redemption arrives is their religious duty. Summary. Well, this concludes the book, My Promised Land. To summarize my entire presentation. First, this is a work that reflects on the colonial nature of the Zionist movement. The author courageously challenges Israel's mainstream ideology and questions the legitimacy of the Zionist movement. Second, there are 2 major controversial topics in the story of Israel: the Lydda massacre and the settlement movement. Israel builds settlements on the occupied Arab territories, which on the surface seems to continue the Zionist movement, but in fact reveals Israel's colonial nature and entangles Israel and Middle Eastern geopolitics in great uncertainty. Lastly, Zionism faces 2 doubts. Arabs question the Jews' fabrication of biblical stories to turn the tables and drive Arabs out, while Jewish religious leaders question the Zionists' violation of their oaths by using force to return to the Promised Land and even trying to control the fate of the Jews themselves, which goes against the essence of Judaism. That's the essence of this book. You can click the description below the video to find the link to the book. Welcome to read it. You can also share this book with your friends. If you like the content of Daily Book Dive, click the subscribe button to stay updated. Your encouragement helps us continue bringing book essence to our community. Congratulations, you've finished another book.